Hi everyone, good morning. I'm super excited to talk to you all about my journey for the last 3 years since I've graduated, being a fairly young architect in the industry and also through my years through architecture school. I wanted to take you through some lessons that I've learned and some thoughts that I've added to my philosophy of architecture and life in general. I hope you will find some inspiration and motivation to build your own approach after this session. So this is called the Maslow's Pyramid of Human Needs. Abraham Maslow talks about how humans go through this hierarchy of needs in life, from basics such as food and shelter all the way up to the ultimate fulfillment of self-actualization. So I have a hypothesis that this exists differently for architects, and I will come to that at the end of my presentation. I will give you a second to read through this and understand how this pyramid of hierarchy of human needs works. I've divided the presentation into 3 parts, which I'm calling the orientation, where I want to talk about my introduction to architecture and architecture school. The path, where I want to share some insights that I've built through my journey, all the way back from architecture school to this day of my practice. And then what I'm calling the beyond, where I want to show you some examples of work where these lessons and insights have helped me. But what I'm going to do is actually go backwards in chronological order and start with the beyond, then the path, and then the orientation. I've had the wonderful opportunity of starting my career with one of the leading architecture firms in India, where I learned how to build and design on a large scale. And I also got to work with urban planning and research. And now I currently work with a large startup where I've had the opportunity of being involved in a very productized delivery of design, but also on a large scale. But the projects that I want to talk to you about are very different in scale, in context, in the design approach. And like I said, these are a product of the learnings and insights that I will talk to you about in the course of the presentation. With a few like-minded people in 2015, I started a collective called the Open Box Project with a simple objective in mind of collaborating with talented people across the world to explore design through interventions, through workshops, through research projects, basically whatever it took to understand and explore design the way we saw it. And that's how we ended up starting the Open Box Project. And I'm going to talk about some of the projects we've taken up as part of this collective. The first one I want to talk to you about is what we call literally the Open Box. This was a small construction workshop we did at the annual NASA convention in Jaipur. The intention was to explore wood construction and joinery through a open pavilion that provides a space for students to hang out, to sit in, to play around, and maybe even host small gatherings. This entire structure was made by hand over 3 days along with the participants. We used an interesting 3-axis joinery that you can see to put together the structural members, and we used simple lap joints to connect all the vertical fins. The idea was not to build the structure for getting the structure together, but to create a space where we could explore the small little things of wood construction. And it was a very interesting project that we got to do. The next one is quite interesting. We call it the Reflection Pavilion. So in the hills of Vagamon in Kerala, we worked with around 35 architecture students to build this pavilion. This was another timber construction project where we wanted to explore structural design a little further. This pavilion is about 5 meters tall and 2.5 meters wide. It has an elevated deck where people can sit and meditate, reflect, while enjoying the beautiful view of a valley that it looks down into. It has a space below the deck where you can hide from the rain and take shelter. This pavilion is very transparent because we thought it would be criminal to block off the views of the nature that the site had to offer. This project was a very good construction logistical challenge. We built it over 3 days again, working day and night with all our participants. And what you see on the bottom right is the site where we started the work, and on the left is the final product. The next is a more recent project, actually from last year, that we did. This is what we call the Level Up Pavilion. We did this project as part of EASA. EASA is the European Architecture Students' Assembly, which happened in Croatia in 2018. This was also done with a bunch of participants, around 22 architecture students from across Europe. This was a site-specific adaptive reuse proposal where we wanted to bring life to this disused rooftop. The box that you see, it's basically a machine room, and we wanted to create an interactive breakout space which would add value to this large structure, which is basically industrial storage building, which is in the process of being converted to a large cultural center for Rijeka when it turns to the culture capital of Europe in 2020. Rijeka has this industrial heritage, and this site is right on the harbor next to a canal, and we wanted to bring this out through the aesthetic of structure as well. which is why we used scaffolding and exposed timber to create the pavilion. We constructed this project over 2 weeks, a team of 20 to 22 participants. This was the final product, and this is how people end up using it. This is another view of the same pavilion being used at night. We're fortunate enough to have this project published in a lot of spaces, so if you're interested to check it out, you can go see them. The next project I want to talk about is this research project called City Stories. This was a theoretical project we did in Bangalore with a bunch of talented students of architecture. The intention of this project was, one, to critically examine the role of architects and the relationship between an architect and the city, and two, to understand a city on a more micro level from the lens of its everyday users. Through the course of this project, as we wanted to visit a lot of Bangalore's urban nodes and neighborhoods, turns out a huge part of the process was just pushing around broken down buses and being stuck in traffic jams, which is what we did most of the time. But we ended up documenting and studying some beautiful aspects of the city. For one, we spent a lot of time with the whole spectrum of users and documented their everyday experience of city spaces. We tried to understand how some spaces unintentionally and organically turn into rich social spaces. We spent time with pedestrians, with hawkers, with autowalas, with shop owners, and tried to connect their perception of the city to our analysis of the city. These are some of the users we spoke to. More importantly, we spent time to help the students develop new approaches and perspectives to not just architecture and urbanism, but to the humans who are part of this architecture and urbanism. What you see here is all the participants holding up their takeaways from this project. I'll give you a second to read through. We are also in the process of compiling this entire study, and we'll be publishing it soon. Over the last 1 year, I've worked with a very special non-profit organization called Lakir, which has been focused on helping raise the quality of life in cities and making life in cities more equitable. Why we're doing this at Lakir is because India is preparing for the biggest human migration ever on the planet. And by 2030, we expect over 600 million people would have moved to urban areas. And this is a huge deal. Cities are social and economic hubs, but the problem is that they have dismal sustainability, and if we don't do something, they will implode. We realize that one way to solve this is to take a data-driven approach and see if we can look at these problems and figure out solutions on a more data-driven level. So at Lucky, we built a geospatial analytical tool called CitySat that helps administrators measure and improve city health by monitoring a bunch of indicators like transport, like health, education, water, housing, administrative boundaries, and many more. I want to talk about a big win that we had with Lakir last year. This was regarding affordable housing. You see 3 maps at the bottom of the screen. The first one was a map of all the affordable housing units in the city. Now, why we were mapping this is that generally we felt for some reason the affordable housing units are failing, and we wanted to understand why. So we first put all the affordable housing units of the city on a map. What you see on the second map is the social infrastructure that enables these affordable housing units to function. Now, what we need to understand is that this social infrastructure like schools, hospitals, bus stop, other transport hubs are very important to enable a certain quality of life for these affordable housing units. And we want to check if that is existing or not. And we realized after overlapping these layers that many of these affordable housing units are in what we're calling transport deserts. So basically they had no access to bus stops, and which is why we realized that at some level they're failing. And we took this information to the city administrators, and they also understood the problem, and immediately they extended their bus lines to these affordable housing units, which is a huge win. The simple action of overlapping relevant data helped solve a seemingly complicated problem. Next, I want to talk about this interesting project that we did this summer in Switzerland called SecondSkin. Now, this project was an intersection of product design, textile design, and architecture. The intent was to see if we can find a design framework or a design solution to help create multi-function, transformable objects that would somehow help user groups like homeless people and maybe people who are suffering because of the refugee crisis. And what I mean by that is we wanted to figure out if we can create a design framework which people can use to create multifunction objects like, for example, a rainproof jacket that converts to a shelter using methodology and material that is around. Our approach to this project was pretty simple. We realized that this framework is going to answer a basic need. It has to be multifunctional. It has to be transformable because that makes it more useful. It has to be a do-it-yourself approach so that the users can make it themselves. And it has to be independent of skilled methodology like stitching, like cutting, like sewing. And only that would make it deployable the way we wanted to. So what we ended up with was we worked with this really popular, really talented textile designer called Anush Sharma, who runs a studio called Button Masala, who came up with this basic fabric to fabric joinery, which he calls Button Masala. And we realized that if we bring that into this framework, we were essentially reimagining the fundamental material joinery, not just between fabric to fabric, but fabric to object and fabric to structural elements. And that's what we tried to do. Coming back to the fact that these need to be transformable and multifunction, we had to pick a certain spectrum of objects that we were looking at least for the sake of this exercise, this prototyping exercise. So we wanted to create objects like jackets, raincoats, garments, bags, life jackets, sleeping bags, hammocks, and shelters. Basically, these would help our target user groups. One of the most important parts of our philosophy was that we were creating an anti-product. What that means is that we were not trying to create a finished product that would have to be either bought off the shelf or it would have to be distributed to these user groups. We wanted to create an anti-product that can be created by the user. And what that means is we are trying to replace the designer by the user itself. These are some shots from the first prototyping exercises we did together. What you see is the same piece of fabric using the methodology and in the form of grid. And we've tried to convert it from a storage unit to a garment to a shelter. And this is where we started. Then we started our workshop and exercises in Villars with a bunch of talented architects from across Europe. We started the workshop with simple explorations of fabric to fabric joinery to understand how garments would work. Then we took this and started exploring joinery between the garment, between the fabric to objects. And then we started creating full-fledged, I would call them objects again, but in this case, you can see a raincoat and a bag. And we explored this further. We kept experimenting. We created hammocks from the same methodology. It's basically the same object which is transforming into different forms. And we ended up with about 10 prototypes. I'll quickly tell you about those. This is Angela from Croatia. She wanted to do something with refugee kids who are on the run with their parents. Because of the kind of trauma they go through. So you want to create a bag which converts to a shelter, which also helps them create their own little safe space. So this is the bag which converts to a shelter like this. You can also see the string and the sticks. So basically also converts to some sort of a game that they can play with. This is Adriana from Greece. She wanted to create a jacket for the traveler, which converts to a shelter like this. And this is what we worked on, basically a suspended shelter. What we also worked on with her was this jacket where the buttons are essentially replaced by seeds. The idea was to create a wearable farm. And the symbolic idea behind this was when you find a place that you want to settle, you basically take this jacket off, you put it in the ground, you push the seeds in, and eventually it turns into your own little farm. This is Zdravka from Croatia again. With her, we worked on a garment that essentially converts to a sleeping bag, but also at the same time converts to a very easily deployable shelter like this one. So the focus here was on the modularity and the deployability of this shelter. This is Marinos from Cyprus. With him, we want to work on a high altitude hiking vest, which would be functional and also would survive the cold. So this is the initial prototyping phase, and then we worked on, the idea was obviously to make this more compact and wearable. So this is one of the initial concepts. And then we worked on how we could create storage for objects on this garment, how it would convert to a one-man tent like this. This is Nida from Turkey. With Nida, we wanted to, our user group were these refugees who were using boats to get away from situations. And apparently the reality is also that often these refugees are given fake life jackets and many of them end up drowning in the seas because of that. Nida wanted to work on a life jacket. If you notice, we used bottles in this jacket. This is what it looks like, and we also tested it and it works. This is Yulia from Moldova, and with her we tried to create a garment which also converts to a shelter, but with large, deep pockets, with the idea of a gatherer who's going through the forest and is able to collect things. This is Sheila from Serbia. Her target user group were these young gypsy mothers who are homeless on the streets of Serbia, and she wanted to create something for them. So what we worked on with her was this rainproof jacket that also has a baby pod on the inside where the baby can be kept safe. And it also converts to a shelter like this. Now the idea is that this is a suspended shelter, so it can be easily placed in these negative urban spaces. We further explored the same methodology with modularity, like I told you before. This is one of the options of a modular structure which can be expanded in two directions. We also tried other larger shelter ideas where we could fit about 10 to 15 people. And that's about that. So like I said, I wanted to go backward in chronology, and now that I've spoken to you about some of the projects, I want to go back to what I'm calling the path. Recently, I had the opportunity of speaking at my organization about a few insights and realizations that I've had while looking for a purpose and motivation for myself as an architect. And I thought I would like to share those with you as well, through examples of phases of my life as a student, So this is sort of where my story starts. I was one of those students preparing for an engineering entrance exam for almost 5 years of my life, from 8th grade to 12th grade. And on the first day of my exam, which was the first exam that I was going to take, I somehow decided to skip it. I had a feeling that this was not for me. And what happened after that is I went ahead and skipped all my engineering entrance examinations and decided to take a year off to explore and discover what I wanted to do. It took me a year to figure out that architecture was a field for me. And I'm sure most of you did better than that. But before I joined architecture, during this sabbatical, I didn't want to spend the year preparing for another exam, but I wanted to figure out what my life's calling was, and that takes a little bit of work. I was lucky enough to have my parents' support on this. At the start of the year, I had the opportunity of being part of an expedition supported by the National Geographic Society, where we were studying the Godavari River Valley from an ecological, environmental standpoint. This was for about a month. After this, I worked with a youth organization called ISEC, where I worked on projects with underprivileged children and AIDS awareness. What I also got was a huge insight into how to work as a professional, how to communicate, how to work with teams, etc. I spent this entire year meeting people, traveling to places, and realized that I wanted to be a technical person, but I also wanted to be a designer. And then realized that where these two worlds meet is probably where you get to design spaces, which is why I call this year my year of Kumbaya moments, and it was probably the most important year of my life. And I had a set of insights from this year, right? I understood that the kind of opportunities that exist for me are some that fall into your lap, like me being a part of that expedition. That was an opportunity that fell into my lap and I took it. Some that need to be chased, like wanting to be a part of ISEC, which has a long and complicated selection process. But I really wanted to do it, so I ran through it. And then some that need to be created from scratch. For example, wanted to be an architect. I had no context to architecture before. But then once I realized that this is something that I wanted to do, I created that opportunity for myself and made sure that I joined architecture as a course. What I'm trying to say is that we must seek and build these opportunities for ourselves or run after them. And if they don't exist, create them from scratch. All three of these are important, and I think success is absolutely eminent with a combination of these. When I was finally in architecture school, I got to lead the student council, where we worked towards the interests of the architecture students in Ramaya. Ramaya is the school that I went to in Bangalore. On the left side, you can see some coverage of the events and the congregations that we built and worked on together. I was fortunate enough to have a beautiful team to work with. Later in architecture school, I got to be a part of the leadership of the National Association of Students of Architecture, or NASA as we call it, where we did the same except for the entire country's student community. This was a great opportunity. I got to be part of national design competitions, trophies, conferences, publications as part of my work. These experiences made me realize the power of people coming together for common goals to solve problems and to share knowledge and culture, which is what led to my next set of insights. That if you're able to build communities around your passion, it will only catapult them to unbelievable heights. These communities will help you create more opportunities for yourself and everyone who is a part of them. And I feel that only these opportunities can fuel the motivation and the sense of purpose that you want to create. Over the past few years, I've had the opportunity to be part of this beautiful community of designers and architects from all over Europe and many more countries across the world called IASA, which stands for the European Architecture Students Assembly. I was part of the first Indian delegation that went to Malta in 2015, and I've been part of this community ever since. We basically come together once a year, around 400 architecture and design students and graduates. We explore architecture through design, through workshops, through talks, through discussions, and more or less just spending time together. I tutored 2 design/construction workshops with IASA in Croatia and Switzerland that I spoke to you about. To be able to understand different perspectives of architecture and life from people from across the globe gave me my biggest learning in architecture. Not just this, but also going through architecture school, coupled with this experience, gave me my biggest learning in architecture so far. And that is the fact that architecture is completely subjective. It is not black and white, it is gray. And I think that understanding this subjectivity can be a superpower as a designer, and we must embrace it. This brings me to the final part that I wanted to talk about. And this is me going back to my square one, where it all started for me at architecture school. And I wanted to share how architecture hit me in the face and what insights I developed from that. And obviously, I will start with the million-dollar question. What is architecture? Is it the mother of all arts? Is it frozen music, like Johann Wolfgang said? Or is it simply us professionals creating spatial solutions for our users? Now, just like counting the number of lines on this graphic or the number of interpretations we can make out of this composition, I feel we will never reach a consensus to answer that question. I am always asked, what is the difference between engineers and architects? If you give one problem to 100 engineers, they will all give you that one perfect, correct solution. But when you give the same problem to architects, they will surprise you with 100 different correct answers. And that, for me, is what architecture is about. It's about thinking beyond solutions. It is thinking of the possibilities, which is also why I say that architecture is not just a course, it's not just a career, but it becomes a way of life, a way of thinking. I had a funny teacher who on our first day at school said that if you want to become an architect, you have to live architecture, you have to start talking architecture, you have to eat architecture and sleep architecture. And I always wonder, what is it about architecture that makes us that way? I think what you should take away from the course is not just the knowledge to design and construct buildings, but the ability to be critical, analytical, to be somebody who can question things, who can learn and more importantly, unlearn, who can teach, who can be taught, somebody who can evaluate and be evaluated. It's like being entrusted with all the values that life has to offer. We must broaden our horizons and create a habit of understanding everything on a micro and a macro level. It's funny how one day you'll realize, and one day I did too, that all the jargon we learn in architecture also applies to life. And that's also why we call it an architecture school, right? Why do you call it a school of architecture, like medicine or law? It's because you have to forget everything you learned before and start from scratch, even writing alphabets for that matter. You will hear a lot of people say that architecture school teaches you nothing. And it's completely different once you get outside. That's true to a certain extent. But you know why that is? It's because it takes 5 years of architecture school to develop the aptitude and the attitude to get ready to learn architecture. And from then on, it's learning for the rest of your life. And that's also why it's called running a practice, because you can never be perfect. You should remember that the most important thing that you can take away from school is your ability to build your own process and your approach to architecture, and to realize that it is infinite and never constant. And that, for me, is the most beautiful crisis about architecture. I'm going to bring you back to this slide that I showed you in the start. I've realized that great architects have found themselves at the intersection of what they love to do, what they're good at doing, and whether or not they can make a living out of that. And it'll be great if all of this is somewhere aligned with what the world needs. Now, my hypothesis on the Maslow's pyramid is that this is not how it works for architects. It's not a pyramid of hierarchy for architects. In fact, for architects, this is a continuous circle of needs that we deal with. Sometimes we chance upon self-actualizations first and then worry about basic needs. Sometimes we reach something else. But we must approach all of this together, and that, I think, is what makes life more fulfilling for us as designers. And I will start concluding with that. What I want to say in the end is that I hope we will all be able to orient ourselves, create our own paths, and be able to go beyond. Thanks, guys. I hope this session was valuable. This is my email ID. You can get in touch with me if you want to talk about something. And all the best.